Can you hear me talk, Bill? Okay, I'll try to talk louder. Good evening. My name is Robert Oswald, and Michelle, this is my pointer. Yeah. Michelle and I took a bit of a trip over 9 months down the East Coast, and that's what I'll try to tell you about tonight. This was us right around Thanksgiving in South Carolina. One of the advantages of taking this trip is we missed the Ithaca winter. So
You look kind of bundled up, though.
it was a little cool that day. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what I thought I'd do is talk about the trip. This is sort of the way we went. We basically went down to Key West and then back. What I think I'll do is I'll just talk about it in one direction, but make comments about both directions. So when we get to a certain point, I'll say, this is what happened on the way back, maybe, and this is what happened on the way down. And then at the end, I thought I'd say something about what we learned, and if anybody actually wanted to do this. And you can see what I displayed here. That has significance. Anyway, so our boat is a Sabre 362 sailboat. It's 36 feet long. It has a 12-foot beam and a 5-foot draft. So all of that becomes important when you think about sailing. It also has a wing keel. But because as you're traveling, you really need to know your draft, because not everybody gets to sail in 400 feet deep water like we do here. And we learned that a number of times. Okay, so why don't we get started? We go to the next slide. Okay, so we took off from here. There's only one way out of the lake on a sailboat, or pretty much any other boat, except maybe a kayak, and that is to take off north to the Erie Canal. And in order to do that, you can't have a mast up, because the lowest bridge is about 14 feet. So our 55-foot mast couldn't go under it. So we started off down at Finger Lakes, and they pulled the boat. We painted the bottom, waxed the hull, took the mast down, put it back in the water, came up to North Docks. We couldn't fit in the marina anymore because of the 55-foot mast on top of our boat. And then hurricane struck New York City. The Erie Canal closed for a few weeks. And finally, we were able to get off on September 3rd. This is us leaving about 6 a.m. in the morning. Our son brought us down to North Docks and took a picture of us leaving. And so we were off. The Erie Canal is fun the first time you do it. You go through about 25 locks to get down to the Hudson River. You go through some interesting areas, don't get me wrong. For example, this is one of the ruins of the original canal that had aqueducts. They're no longer aqueducts. It's mainly just a ditch and the Mohawk River that you go through. But the main feature is tons and tons of locks. This is lock 17, which is the largest lock on the canal. It is a 40-foot lift or drop. Coming from here and going to the Hudson, you're mainly going down on the locks. There are only 3 that go up, and coming back is just the opposite. We went down on the way out and up on the way back on this lock. This lock takes a long time to fill and a long time to get through, but when we went through it the last time, they only allowed people on one side of the lock, and part of that was destroyed. And so they only had 3 boats at a time to go through, so that's a really big bottleneck. This was lock 10. We learned about windage at lock 10. It was blowing about 20 knots into the lock, and we decided that that's where we would tie up for the night. One of the things we learned is that when you have the wind behind you, to flip up the front of the Dodger to decrease your windage. Otherwise, the boat does what it wants to, and you're there trying to hold on to the side of the lock, and it doesn't work very well. Okay, so we went through about 25 locks, and go on. And finally, at the end, you get to a series of 5 locks called the Waterford Flight. It drops you down about 160 feet through those 5 locks over a course of maybe a couple of miles. And then you get to the Waterford Visitor Center, which is here, and that's us tied up at the Waterford Visitor Center. And that's a really nice place to provision. They have a grocery store nearby and everything. It's really nice. But after that, just like right out here, you enter the Hudson River. Okay, and the Hudson River, as you turn south on the Hudson, about a mile down is the last lock, which is the Federal Lock. And at that point, you enter the part of the Hudson that really defines it for the rest of the time. And the Hudson is a river that is totally tidal. It'll run in both directions at very high current. So, and it gets worse as you go down. So you really have to time your transits down the Hudson to try to get with the current. Otherwise you can be slowed. It could be up to 3 knots against you sometimes. So you think, okay, I'm just going to go down the Hudson to New York City. No, the current could be flowing up from New York City at 3 knots sometimes. So that's one of the things you have to consider. About 40 miles south of there, there's an inlet that you can go into where there are a couple of marinas that'll put your mast back up. And that's what we did. There are 2 marinas there. One which was really nice people, very competent, charge you a reasonable price. And then there's another marina that is exactly the opposite. So we chose one we liked. And they got our mast up. We actually chose the other one the first time we did this, and we'd never do that again. It's in Catskill, New York, or Hoppanoose. And then you take off down the Hudson. It's really kind of hard to sail sometimes in the Hudson because many times the wind is not that favorable. So you tend to motor more than sail, but sometimes you can motor sail at least. There are a lot of interesting things along the way because the Hudson is really beautiful. There are a lot of lighthouses. That's the first one there. It's the Hudson Athens Lighthouse, but there are a number of others that are really kind of cool to look at. Then there's this college right here called West Point, which I actually never thought about what West Point means, but there's a point that comes out on the river on the west side, and that's why it's called West Point. The other interesting thing is they have a hotel next to it with a restaurant that's called the Zulu Bar and Grill, Zulu Time Bar and Grill. I was thinking about, well, why would they call it that? Well, of course, Zulu time is Greenwich Mean Time, so they could have happy hour starting at 4 o'clock, and it's really noon. So that's probably why they called it Zulu time. Anyway, so as we went down, on our way down, we got to Bear Mountain State Park, which was made famous by Bob Dylan, and we heard this terrible noise. And Michelle first thought it was a railroad or something like that, but then it was clear that it wasn't. And I first said, is there water coming out the back? She looked back, no. And so we thought, oh my God, it's the raw water pump. And so fortunately, just a few days earlier, I had signed up for Sea Tow. There are basically 2 towing companies, Sea Tow and Boat US, that you can sign up for a nominal fee and get towed pretty much whenever you break down, which for us was a lot. Right as we broke down, a Sea Tow boat came by. So we hailed him. He came over and told us he couldn't help us, but to hail somebody, to call them. So somebody came, and if we go to the next slide, towed us to Haverstraw, which is Haverstraw Bay, which had a marina, and we got in there and found a mechanic, took the thing apart, and we found that we have a gear that drives the raw water pump. It's supposed to be a slot, except there's a hole there, and the raw water pump has a slot, but that was round. So basically, it was fitting in here. This gear was spinning, and nothing was happening. So we called up Westerbeek. We have a Westerbeek engine. We called up Westerbeek, and they said, "Oh yeah, we have the water pump. It's only $700, and 4 to 6 weeks to get the gear." So we called every place in the whole country that sold Westerbeek parts. Nobody had it. So we finally told our saga on a listserv for Sabre owners. And a guy from Maine emailed us and said, "I think I have one in my garage." and so he sent a picture, and it was, and he sent it to us. And then it turned out the mechanic had one of these parts in his spare one of the pumps in his spare part bag, and he said, "I'll sell it to you for half price." So we I don't know how it happened. We were up and running again, and we finally, after 4 to 6 weeks, got the part from Westerbeek and sent it to the guy in Maine. So we got going, and we carried on down the Hudson from Haverstraw. It's a pretty easy run with the current. That day we were right with the current. We're making up to 8 or 9 knots in our boat that hardly ever goes above 6. So that was pretty amazing. We went through the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is now the Mario Cuomo Bridge. On the way back, we couldn't stay in Manhattan because the 79th Street boat basin is no longer. So we stayed here at just past the Mario Cuomo Bridge at Nyack Boat Club. But on the way down, we got to stay at the 79th Street boat basin just as it was about to close, and it was really cool. Really having dinner in Midtown Manhattan on our boat. That was a lot of fun. It was actually a lot of fun also to pick up a mooring with 3-knot currents. I lost the boat hook on our first attempt, and we went back with another boat hook and were able to snag it and bring it back on board. And we actually, mainly because of Michelle's boat handling skills, we were able to snag the mooring the second time. When you get to lower Manhattan, however, it's kind of challenging because you have these things, which are the Staten Island ferries. And one thing about a Staten Island ferry is that they don't really alter course for anyone, so you have to watch them. And plus, there are many others. There are ferries out to the Statue of Liberty, their Circle Line, everything else. So you really have to be careful. So what we did, basically, when you get to Lower Manhattan, you have a choice. You can go up into Brooklyn, or you can go over to Sheep's Head, but not Sheep's Head. That's where we went. Sandy Hook. To hang out and then figure out what you're going to do next. So we went to Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn. That's it shown here. We stayed on the way down. We stayed at the Sheep's Head Bay Yacht Club. On the way back, we actually spent 2 weeks there waiting for the Erie Canal to open at the Miramar Yacht Club, which is a really great place, really nice, welcoming yacht club. Anyway, so. Well, let me tell you a little bit about coming back actually in Lower Manhattan. When we were in Sheep's Head Bay for the 2 weeks waiting for the Erie Canal to open, we finally said, okay, it's time to go. I had timed the currents in the Hudson just to leave, and then we had fog for 3 days. And then finally on the 3rd day, we still had a bit of a window to make the current, and we took off. We got to about Coney Island, and I started seeing fog over Coney Island. We got to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and as we were coming up, we saw the fog and the container ships, top of the container ships above the fog, and then it just closed in on us. So we're exactly where we didn't want to be, in the middle of New York Harbor in dense fog. Fortunately, we had radar and AIS, and I was out on the bow trying to see. Michelle was back with her eyes glued to the screen looking for boats, and after about an hour it cleared, and we made it. Anyway, so getting back to Sheep's Head Bay, on the way down, we said, okay, what are we going to do next? We have to go down the Jersey coast. to get to the Delaware Bay, and then from the Delaware Bay up to Delaware Bay, across the Chesapeake Delaware Canal and into the Chesapeake Bay. So we had to figure out how to do that. So mostly people on sailboats take the Jersey coast in one shot because there are very few inlets that you want to go into unless you have really perfect weather, and even then there's a lot of shoaling. About the only place is the Upseekin Inlet at Atlantic City, but you know, by that time you're two-thirds of the way down and you might as well just go on to Cape May. So we were there on a Saturday. We actually met some friends from Lake Ontario, Dave Lochner and Susan Balducci, who also have a Sabre 362, and we're going to do it together. And so we were looking at the weather, and we decided, okay, we're probably going to go Monday or Tuesday. That's what looks best. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to call Chris Parker of the Marine Weather Center, and Chris is a really good sailor, but he's also a really good meteorologist. And for a fee, a really modest fee, you can call him and talk about planning. And so I called him on Sunday, and he said, well, Monday will be a little sporty. You'll have 15 to 20 knots all the way on your beam, so you won't have any trouble sailing the whole course. And Wednesday, just forget it, you're going to have 20 to 25 knots on your nose. Or Tuesday, you're going to have 20 to 25 knots on your nose. But he said, if I were you, I'd just go today. And you'll motor about the first third of the way and you'll sail the rest of the way. So we told Dave and Susan we're leaving. We took off, and it was exactly that. We sailed about the first third of the way, and the rest of the way, we motored the first third of the way and then sailed the rest of the way. Had a beautiful, what was about 120-mile passage, about 17 hours. We left in the afternoon on Sunday and got there Monday morning to Cape May. The Cape May Inlet is the best one along the way, but it was actually, that day it was a little tricky to get in, but everything was fine. So we got in. We can go to the next one. The other wonderful thing about that trip was that it was done on a full moon. So we saw the sunset over the New Jersey coast and the sunrise, or the moonrise over the Atlantic, and it was beautiful the whole time. Anyway, so you get to Cape May. We stayed at a place called Uchis Marina, which was a little bit political for our tastes. They were selling, political swag in the bait shop, which wasn't very friendly to us. But anyway, we carried on there. One of the things that you have to do then is decide which way you're going to go. You can go around the point at Cape May, or you can go through the Cape May Canal. The Cape May Canal has bridges that are said to be 55 feet at mean high water. When I went over to look at the height charts or height boards there, at high tide it was about 51 feet. And so we actually had a guy next to us at that marina who'd been under there many, many times in many, many different sailboats, and he told us what to do. So the idea was to go through at mean low tide, or at dead low tide, and go to one side of the bridge, which was higher than the other. And so low tide was 3 a.m. the next morning. So we took off at 3 a.m. the next morning. And then when we got through the canal, then you're in the Delaware Bay. It turns out if you go through a low tide, you then turn up the Delaware Bay. The current is a little bit against you, but within about an hour it turns in your favor. And so we had wind from the south and then current following us or pushing us along. And so we had a really, really pretty nice trip up the Delaware Bay. It's a place you don't want to be when you have current against wind, and you don't want to really be out there when it's above 15 knots wind. We probably had 13 to 20 knots most of the time, but the current was with us, so it was all right. We did see the beautiful New Jersey shore. Michelle's from New Jersey, so she appreciates it.
A lot of New Jersey.
But they did have one lighthouse, the Skip John Lighthouse. That was kind of nice. And we finally got up to the canal. We went across the canal to the Chesapeake Bay and got into the Chesapeake Bay. And after about 70 miles, anchored at the Bohemia River there. And that's the other saber that was with us, Susan Dave's saber in the Bohemia River. So that was really great. We finally got to the Chesapeake Bay. We've always loved the Chesapeake, and it's a nice place to stay. What's that?
You got up the bay and through the canal on one tide.
On one tide, yeah.
Wow.
It was unbelievable. Everybody told us it wouldn't happen. But I think the combination of the wind behind us and we hit it just right. On the way back, there was no way to do that. It was really hard. So what we decided to do was to go to through to Chesapeake, or not Chesapeake City, to Delaware City, which is right above the canal, and then try to time it from there. And we finally figured it out that what we should do is leave at sort of mid-tide from Delaware City, and we could catch most of the current down the bay. And then, I couldn't figure out how we would ever get through the bridges at low tide, so we decided we'd just go on and go up to New York. And so we, again, consulted with Chris Parker about that. And he said, this is really good. You're going to be able to go down the bay. You're going to have the wind behind you and the current with you. And then the wind's predicted to change about the time you get to the bottom and turn to the north, actually turn sort of to the west. And so we sailed up, up the Jersey coast until finally it sort of died a bit and clocked more around to the south. But we still had, at that time, we made about a 33-hour passage back to New York. That was the way back. So that was fun. The guy at the marina in Delaware City told us we should never leave. We actually ended up leaving there at about 3 a.m. He said, don't leave there unless you've had cataract surgery. I said, I haven't had my cataract surgery yet, but we're leaving anyway. And he said, oh, good. I'm really happy to hear that because I do salvage operations and I'll be able to sell.
Very encouraging.
Yeah, he was really, really nice guy. I loved him. And so we said, heck with you, we're leaving. And it was fine. Anyway, we can go on. It was. Oh, you did? Okay, so Chesapeake Bay is a great place, a wonderful anchorage. This one is Still Pond, which is one of the beautiful anchorages on the west side we went to. And then we worked our way down to go to Annapolis. We thought, oh, we'll get to Annapolis, and it's going to be a couple of weeks before the fall boat show, so it should be okay to get in there, maybe get a mooring and hang out in Annapolis. Well, we got to Annapolis. Unfortunately, it was on the weekend, and when we got into Spa Creek, there was probably more boats than there was open water. It was just solid packed boats. Of course, there were no moorings, so we went around to the other side of Annapolis, Back Creek, and we tried to anchor, but there were no places to anchor, and so we just sort of gave up, and so that we didn't go to Annapolis on the way down. We ended up going down to South River and anchored. But on the way back, however, we did spend a few days in Annapolis, and it was really a lot of fun to be there. It's a great place. When we got to South River, our son, who's a resident at New York Presbyterian, came down to join us sailing. He was able to sneak on the boat in a private marina on the South River, and we got to sail with him for a few days. We went to St. Michael's, which is again on the east shore there, and also Oxford. Oxford actually has one of the nicest marinas we stayed in there. It's beautiful. Well, we were about to leave. That's the marina. Well, when we were about to leave Oxford, I walked out on the fuel dock just to see how things were, how the wind was and such. And nobody else was around. The guys that were supposed to be out there weren't there. And I saw this boat coming in. I thought, well, I've been pretty well trained at the Ithaca Yacht Club to grab a line whenever anybody comes in. So I'll just grab their line. And so I went to grab the line. I looked up and it said, Carolyn. And I saw Bill at the Bill was at the helm. This is Quicksilver. So that was great. So I got to tour magnificent Quicksilver. That was very nice. And we actually got to take off and sail a little bit together. That was a lot of fun. So then we crossed back over to the west side and sort of the south part of the Chesapeake. We like the anchorages on the west side. One of the ones we stopped at was Prentice Creek. This is one that Michelle and I anchored there. I don't know, it was like 5 or 6 years ago, 2016. It was our 30th anniversary cruise we chartered, and it was the first time we ever anchored overnight. And so we went back to exactly the same place and took exactly the same picture of the sunrise. And it's a beautiful anchorage. But there are a bunch of really nice anchorages down there. Another one that comes to mind that was great was Mill Creek. There's some nice ones in Object Bay. There are just so many nice places you can go there. Okay. But then all good things come to an end, and you get to Norfolk. Norfolk is a really shipping naval capital. It's one of the busiest inlets. You know, you're lucky if you get in without encountering a submarine. On the way down, we decided to stay there in Portsmouth, which is on the other side of it's sort of like Portsmouth and Norfolk and Newport News are all together, but Portsmouth is on one side of the river, Norfolk is on the other. We stayed in Portsmouth. It was not a very nice marina. It was noisy, smelly. The boatyard worked 24 hours a day, and they were very loud. So we got out of there. On the way back, we actually stayed in Norfolk itself, and it was just the opposite. It was a really nice town. We really enjoyed it. Actually, Portsmouth was a nice little town too, but it was only a very small part of it that was nice. We then went on a little bit further for reasons I'll mention. We went down to Chesapeake, or Great Bridge, which is just about 10 nautical miles down the way from Norfolk. And it was a really good place to provision. It's also a really interesting little place where they have where a Revolutionary War battle was fought, and there's a museum that talks about it, and there's some nice walking trails. It's a really nice place, so we stayed there for a day or so. But then after that, that's when you really start the Intracoastal Waterway. And the Intracoastal Waterway there, it sort of starts off with a few kind of little challenges. You have Currituck Sound, you have followed by Albemarle Sound, followed by the Alligator River, any of which can kick up waves with current, current against wind. And so on the way down, we were really lucky. We sort of timed our weather window from Great Bridge to get down past these little challenges without a problem. On the way back, the only problem was Alligator River. We hit Alligator River with the current coming against us, as well as about 20 knots of wind, and it was just a murderous 20 miles that we had on there, but the rest of it was okay. Anyway, once you get down to the Alligator River, you can pick up this canal called the Alligator Pungo Canal that goes to Belhaven, North Carolina. And that was the last bit of the Intracoastal Waterway that was finished. It's actually really kind of a nice little trip. We didn't know that it was nice on the way down because when we left, it was really foggy in the morning, and it was one of these things of, well, the fog cleared, let's go. And so, of course, we weighed anchor, took off, and the fog closed back in. So we did most of the canal in the fog. Fortunately, we had radar, and we could see where the edge of the canal was. And we finally made it, but you can see there's a lot of wildlife. There's like a bald eagle that we spotted in the fog on the way down. And then we got to Belhaven. Belhaven is a little town that has a beautiful anchorage, huge anchorage field, but there's really not much there except a restaurant and a hardware store and a small population of extremely nice people who, would walk around the town and they'll offer you a ride, No, we're just taking a walk, but Anyway, it was nice. From Belhaven, you sort of go around a point into the Neuse River, which is another place where you can get some wave action, and the attraction on the north side of the Neuse River is Oriental, which we got to know better than we wanted to. Anyway, on the way back, we stayed at Oriental again, and if you notice that this is actually their town website, and we were featured on their town website. Apparently we were some sort of exotic species there. Anyway, so this is the view from the docks there, and basically you had shrimp boats on one side, cruisers on the other side. We spent a couple of days there on the way down, and then took off. If we could go on, and we were crossing the Neuse River at that point. Dodging shrimp boats, and then we got to the other side, and then you get to what's called Adams Creek, that then runs you down basically to the Atlantic, and at Beaufort. And so we were going along, and Michelle said, I think we're going pretty slow. We must have a lot of current here, but then this boat here is sort of like some sort of catch motor sailor or something, who was at the dock with us, and he was telling us how slow this boat is, and it sort of passed us going like we were standing still. And then the smoke alarms went off, and Michelle says, "No, there's something going on here." So I went down and measured, and so the smoke was coming out of the transmission. I measured its temperature. It was like 350 degrees. So we stopped, called Cito. At that point, they said, we don't know where to take you. We don't know what to do about this. So I started calling around. I found a guy in Oriental that was really nice. He said, "I'll help you, but I don't know how to rebuild the transmission or anything." So I finally called Hanson Marine in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and got Fred, who's apparently the owner, who said, "Well, we don't have a transmission like that, but we'll rebuild it for you." I said, "Well, that's great, okay." So he said, "Go back, have them take the transmission out, and send it back to us, and we'll rebuild it." So we did that. We ended up on the other side of Oriental on what's called Whitaker Creek for a couple of weeks. While we sent it back, it got delayed because there was a hurricane at that time. But it finally made it there, and they replaced it. Fortunately, there were like a tiki bar that came around. So we got the transmission, went back, we put it back in, and said, "Let's test it." So Shell got at the helm. I said, "Okay, put it in forward." She put it in forward, and we went backwards. I said, no, put it in forward. I did put it in forward. I said, "Well, put it in reverse." She put it in reverse, we went forward. And so I called Fred back up, and he said, "Yeah, sometimes people put it in backwards. Yeah, you just got to move, just got to take it apart and turn this call around, and then you'll be good." And so he said, "Get the mechanic there, and I'll talk you through it." So we did that. We turned it. Took a half hour to do it. We put it all back together, and it was working fine. So we took off from there the next day. It did go in the right direction, and we went down to Beaufort, Morehead City area, which was kind of a nice area. We stayed there both on the way down and the way back. We actually stayed at Morehead City. And on the way down, we stayed at a place called the Sanitary Fish Market. I guess it was kind of good that their fish was clean. But on the way back, we stayed at a marina. Now, this marina was really concerned about dolphins. They had this warning sign up about not feeding the dolphins and take care of it. But I didn't really understand what the problem was with dolphins. Apparently, Nancy Pelosi kills dolphins. That's what it had on the side. So I thought, gosh, she's a busy woman. So that's great. Anyway, so then we moved on to Camp Lejeune. It's a marine base that's famous for polluted drinking water, but they have a really nice place to anchor called Mile Hammock, and we got there and actually waited out gales. We had like 25 to 30 knot winds consistently for like 3 days. And so when we were about to leave, I thought, well, I better check the transmission fluid. So I pulled the dipstick out of the transmission fluid. There wasn't any in there. And I looked down and the transmission fluid was in the bilge. So I thought, oh my God. So let's fill it up, see what happens. We filled it up, it started dripping out. So I called Fred up. He said, well, didn't you seal it when you put it back together? I said, you were on the phone with us, man. He said, okay, send it back to us. So we can go on. So we got Cito to tow us again to a place called Anchors Away Boatyard. But they didn't have any slips, so they pulled us out, pulled the transmission. We sent it back to Massachusetts yet again. And so we couldn't stay in the boat, so actually what we did was we rented a car and drove to Mississippi where my mother lives, and we visited her in an assisted living facility. So that way we tried to make good use of that time. We got it back in a week or so and put it back in and took off. And we went on from there to Southport. Southport is at the end of the Cape Fear River. Cape Fear River is really aptly named, I think. It has really high currents, and we didn't even know about that. But we hit it, and we had the current with us, and we had this great sail down there. It was wonderful. Then it just dawned on me, this is one of these rivers that run in both directions. We could have hit it. If we weren't lucky, we could have hit it the other way. And if you hit it the other way, you just stand still. Anyway, so we got to Southport, which also had a very nice marina, and that's when it got cold. That was the first time we actually had frost on our Dodger in the morning. So we stayed there a day or so, and then took off. We got about a few miles down the Intercoastal Waterway, and the smoke alarms went off. And so I went down. Michelle said, "There's something going on down here." So we went down and looked at the engine, and I saw diesel spewing out of the fuel line after the secondary fuel pump. That's it right there. It had this sort of banjo fitting on it, which are, they're not that common, but they're common enough. So I called up Westerbeek and said, well, how long is it going to take? Can you get me one of these? And they said, well, 4 to 6 weeks. So we got towed back to that marina. They had a full service place full service engine repair place. That was a Sunday when we got there. Monday morning I went in and said, oh, you're full service, you can take care of us. They said, yeah, we're full service for outboards. And so, but they said, no, but don't worry about it. We can get you somebody out there. And they got us a mechanic out who turned out to be the best mechanic we had on the whole trip. He looked at it and said, yeah, I can get one of these built. I'll drive over to Wilmington tomorrow morning at 8, have it built. I'll be back tomorrow morning, I'll put it in. And that's what he did. He got it in and got us going again. So we were really lucky. And so then we took off again, finally, after that was our 4th breakdown. So just sort of skipping over a lot of the other areas. South Carolina and Georgia are basically I could describe certain things that, sort of tells the whole story. The one place that was different is this, which is the Waccamaw River, which is a really beautiful area of the Intercoastal Waterway. It's right around Charleston and Georgetown, between Charleston and Georgetown. The rest of it looks sort of like this, sort of like grass that has a crew cut. And the other thing about it is the tides are really extreme. They have 10 to 12 foot tides everywhere. And there are cuts that are probably 4 or 5 cuts along the way that you can't go through at low tide, at least not with our boat. So we were trying to be really careful about that, but one time I messed up. And I didn't catch the area where there was a cut that we couldn't get through, and we hit it at low tide. And I said, we can't get through here. And I looked at the chart and I said, well, there's a way around this. We can go down here and get to this inlet here and then come back and hit the Intercoastal Waterway again. We did that, and we hit an uncharted shoal at low tide and ran aground and had to sit there for a couple hours before the tide rose and pulled us off. The other thing that you see along the way are lots of dredgers. We tried to convince all of them to come up here and dredge the inlet. None of them agreed to do so. The other thing, there are some bridges along the way. We did have to go outside at least one time on the way back to avoid bridges that were inoperable. So basically, South Carolina and Georgia are just extreme tides, shallow water. Be careful, but they also have a lot of wildlife. And you can see this is a bald eagle with a fish on a day marker. And these are a bunch of birds here that we actually emailed Carolyn about and asked them what they were. And she got back to us and told them what they were. But you know, ornithology for me is a really difficult subject. It's really way too complex, and I can't understand it. You know, I would rather think about physics or something like that, which is much simpler than ornithology. But you know what the real genius, I think, in a person is to take a complex subject and boil it down into its essence and explain it to you in a way that that you can understand it. And then Bill Arms did that for me with ornithology, and we can show.
Caroline.
No, he didn't. He said, now I understand. Okay, so at the end of our trip down through Georgia and South Carolina, the end of South Carolina, right before Florida, is a wonderful place called Cumberland Island. It has it's a really big island. It's a national seashore. They have feral horses there. The feral horses are said to, you know, I'm not sure it's been proven, but it's said to date from Spanish people who came to the island in the 16th century and left the horses there, and they've been there ever since. Other people say they're from the 17th century, I'm not sure. Anyway, they have a lot of varied places you can hike there. They have a beautiful seashore. It's kind of cool to be at the beach in December. That was fun. So, and they also have a beautiful Anchorage. So it's a really great place to go. And from there we went on to Florida. Amelia Island is the first place you get to in Florida, and I'm told that it's a really nice place. We had some neighbors move there. They said it was a beautiful place to be, etc. So we were really looking forward to it. We were going to anchor out there and dinghy in and see the town. But when we got there, it basically was a paper mill with a marina next to it. And I'm told that if you actually go in to the marina and go over to the ocean, it's really nice. But we were so turned off by the smell of the paper mill, we just went on. We didn't stay there. But we had lots of dolphins following us at the time. That was kind of fun. So really the first place we got to in Florida that we enjoyed was St. Augustine. The slide over there is the Bridge of Lions, which is sort of the iconic place that you see in pictures of St. Augustine. It's pretty much the oldest city in the United States, European settled city in the United States. It's changed hands between the French and the Spanish and the British and the U.S. over the last few centuries. It has a lot of interesting places. One place we found really fascinating, on the way down we thought it was just a tourist trap. On the way back we went and we found that it was actually really fascinating. It was Castillo de San Marcos, which is a fort that was built. It actually started, I think, in the 16th or 17th century. The first bits of it were started back then. And it's had this fascinating history all through the centuries, actually all the way up pretty much until the end of the 19th century, where they brought the last remnants of the Native American resistance, including Geronimo, who was kept captive there for several years. So it was an interesting place to visit. The town is also has an old city that is really touristy, but there are parts of it that are really nice to walk in. You know, shaded streets, and nice restaurants. It's a good place. We went on from there. From there, you basically go through towns like Cocoa Beach, Daytona Beach, Titusville, etc. We didn't see any. We were looking to see if we could see some launches from the Space Center, but we missed most of those that happened while we were going through. But anyway, most of it wasn't that interesting. Basically, it was traveling through these large lagoons where there was like a narrow cut where it was deep enough to get the boat through, and everything else was pretty shallow. And you can see that here. It's shallow. And that's one of the problems they have in Florida is so many abandoned boats, and that's one of them that we've seen. What we did, so in those lagoons, there were a couple of things that were interesting. One, we anchored in Mosquito Lagoon, and Michelle decided she wanted to go swimming, but then she started thinking about, well, I wonder if there are any sharks here. And so she looked it up, and first thing she saw was the highest incident of shark attacks was in Mosquito Lagoon with people who wear wetsuits. And she was just about to put her wetsuit on. So she didn't go swimming. This is a spoil island where they've dredged and just put the spoils, and then vegetation grows up. We hid behind one of those for a few days one time in a gale. And then finally, when we got to Vero Beach, we got to a place where we sort of enjoyed. Vero Beach is more like a gated community kind of place, but the marina there is sort of strangely attractive. It's mainly moorings, and people can anchor as well. But if you anchor and you want to use a dinghy dock, you pay the same as if you get a mooring, so you might as well get a mooring. They never turn anybody away. If they fill up all the moorings, they put 2 people in the moorings. If they have 2 people in the moorings, they put 3 people in the moorings, etc. I don't think they go beyond 3. We were there, but we were sort of put off by that. But then when we did it, it was fun, and we met some really nice people. But Vero Beach, we spent more time than we liked because it was our last saga. On the way back, we were coming from Peck Lake, which I'll show you in a minute, to Vero Beach on the way home. And it got to be my usual thing to check the engine every hour because I didn't trust it. So I went down and saw antifreeze leaking out of the fresh water pump pretty fast. So I said, so we were motor sailing at that point, and I said, let's turn off the motor, see what happens. So we turned off the motor, and Michelle said, we're going pretty well. I said, okay, let's put up the main. And so we put up the mainsail, and we sailed on a broad reach for 20 miles to Vero Beach. We had to go through a bridge that had to open. I called the bridge operator up and said, you know, we lost our motor. We're coming under sail. He said, I only open an hour and a half hour, but except for emergencies, and I'll call this an emergency. Just come up, you can sail right under it. And that's what we did. He opened it up for us, we went right through. And we sailed right up to the marina at Vero Beach. We talked to the people there. They said, call this guy, he'll help you. We called him up, he said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And so he was a really kind of a weird guy, but he was a pretty good mechanic. And we figured out that it wasn't just a seal on the freshwater pump, it was the bearings that had gone. So I ordered another one. And then he said, well, you better check your heat exchanger. So he took a heat exchanger to a machine shop, and they said, you need a new one. So then I ordered another heat exchanger, and we were putting all those things in, and he said, you know, your motor mount's broken. So then I had to order a motor mount, and we stayed at Vero Beach for 2 weeks, and finally we got out of there. So that was on the way back. Okay. So anyway, so then we, between Vero Beach and Lake Worth, I'll tell you about Lake Worth in a minute, there was this nice anchorage called Peck Lake. That's an example of a place that if you want to anchor there, you probably need to get there in the early afternoon because it fills up fast, but it's a really beautiful place. And that's halfway to Lake Worth. When you get to Lake Worth, it's a huge lake that it's basically an anchorage, so you never have trouble finding an anchorage. And we were there for Christmas, and there were boats everywhere. So that's basically West Palm Beach. So it took us, we had to go through about 10 bridges to get from Peck Lake to Lake Worth, and we were really fed up with asking bridges to be open. And the next step was to get to Fort Lauderdale on the inside, and that was 12 more bridges. There were no good anchorages, there were no good moorings. Maybe we would have been able to drop a hook somewhere, but we just thought about it and we said, let's just skip everything and sail to Key Largo. And then, so we thought about that, and it had a sort of attractive aspects of it. There's apparently, there's a resort on Lake Worth. It's the Latin or Spanish name for, I think it's the Latin name for a lake is Lago, and there's this place that goes between the ocean and the lake. It's called Mar-a-Lago, and we decided we'd pass on the Mar side rather than on the Lago side, which was fine, except on the way back when we did that, right when we got there, we were enveloped in fog. And I didn't know what was going on because the fog was not predicted. And somebody at Cornell told me later that it wasn't fog, it was actually burning documents. So somebody was burning documents. I don't know. But anyway, so again we consulted with Chris Parker. We did about a 22-hour passage to Key Largo. When I talked to Chris, I said, what should we do after we get by Miami? Should we cut in? And basically the keys are you have the keys, and then you have the Hawk Channel, which is just a nice place to sail, and then you have reefs, and then you have the ocean. And I said, should we cut into the Hawk Channel right away, or should we stay on the outside? He said, stay on the outside, don't sail. Don't go on the Hawk Channel at night because there are crab pots and you'll catch a crab pot. So we stayed on the outside, and we just monitored that we were in more than 500 feet of water until the sun came up. Then we were able to cut in and go to the Hawk Channel. And when we got, and this was really a great time. We did see at one other time clear water, but when we got to Key Largo and we anchored between what's called Rodriguez Key and Key Largo. The water was beautiful, clear water, about 12 feet deep, and a plateau, square miles of 12-foot water. It was a beautiful place to anchor. And so we got there after 22 hours and just relaxed. It was really fun. We swam there almost every day. We went on New Year's Day. We went out to snorkel at Molasses Reef. It was good. So if we go to the next. So this is one of the views at Rodriguez Key. This is what Rodriguez Key actually is. It's a mangrove island. As I said, we swam there a lot, and on the last day, basically, before we were leaving, we stayed there on the way down and on the way back. And the last day before we were heading north, we noticed what I thought was like a old bottle, or like a soda bottle in the water. Yes, but then when we looked at it a little more carefully, it wasn't that at all. It was actually Portuguese men of war that were there, and we got some pretty nice pictures of that bottle. So, one of the things we did when we were in Key Largo was take a slip in a marina for a few days, just so we can. It was not an easy way to dinghy into Key Largo from Rodriguez Key, so we just took a slip a bit, and we just walked around the town, saw the African Queen. That's become a big tourist draw there. And one of the things that Michelle always worries about are spiders on her boat. In Key Largo, what they worry about more is the iguanas on your boat. And we were there actually at one time when it was cold and was going to freeze. It was going to freeze that night. And whenever it freezes in Key Largo, there's a warning that's sent out about falling iguanas. Iguanas are on the trees, and they're cold-blooded, so they fall asleep and fall from the trees. We didn't see any of that. There's also a lot of canals, man-made canals in Key Largo. This boat here is a very famous boat. It's owned by a guy named Bob Scherer, or better known as Bob 423. He's written the books on traversing the ICW, and he actually publishes tracks. So almost everybody that goes down, the intercoastal waterway follows his course. And so you can just download it to your chart recorder and follow the way he goes, so you don't run aground. We did run aground once following his charts, well, mostly we did. Anyway, from Key Largo, we stopped at a couple of keys along the way to Key West. This was Long Key. It's one of the few places that you can go from the outside the Atlantic side, the Hawk Channel, into Florida Bay. Because of our draft, we really couldn't travel on the inside. You can sail on the inside in some places, but you can't really continuously travel along there with a 5-foot draft. If you have a 3-foot draft or something, you can be fine. So this is one place where you can get under the bridge. If you notice, there's another bridge there. That's a railroad bridge built by Henry Flagler back in the early part of the 20th century. He's the one that put the railroad down to Key West and actually opened up Key West to tourism. It lasted about 20 years before it was destroyed by a hurricane, and then finally the road was put in, and people drive now rather than go by railroad. But this is really the place where we were able to sail the most. It was a lot of fun to turn the engine off and sail. We felt like along the way we were being followed by this thing that looked like a blimp. It's not a blimp, it's a sort of a dirigible that's tethered to a railroad car, and it's there for surveillance. It's a radar, has radar in it, and it looks for drug smugglers and people trying to get into the country by boat. Apparently, it's been there since the early 80s, and soon after it was put in, some fishermen came along and saw its cable in the water, so they decided to tie their boat to the cable. They had about a 23-foot boat with a 175 horsepower motor, and they demonstrated that they had more horsepower than brains because the dirigible picked up their boat into the air, and they had to jump off to safety, and the Air Force had to come along and shoot the dirigible down with the surface-area missile to get their boat back in the water. They said they were very happy because the engine started. Anyway, one of the things we noticed, the trend, which was very strange, was these big, I think Claire would refer to it as a gin palace, that we're pulling these dinghies. These dinghies are about 30 feet long with about 300 horsepower motors, and that's what they were their dinghies. I thought that was pretty amazing. We saw a number of people doing this. Anyway, there were nice sunsets in the Keys. It was a beautiful place. And finally, we got to Key West. Key West, you have a couple of choices in Key West. You can anchor out near the city. This is Wisteria Island. It takes about a half hour to 40 minutes, maybe an hour on our dinghy to get in from there. Or you could take a mooring in a place that's pretty far from the interesting part of the city, and then I don't know why you'd want to, and even then it's a long dinghy ride in. So we decided to try to get a slip. We actually got a marina that was reasonably priced. Most marinas are $6 to $10 per foot per night there. We found one much cheaper right in the middle of town, and so we were able to stay there almost a week. And it was great. So Key West has a party at Mallory Square to watch the sunset every day. They have performers. We went to that one time. You're supposed to go to the southernmost point. We went there in the rain one time. There was a long line of people waiting to get their picture taken there. So we took a picture of it and left. It was crazy. But anyway, but Key West is a really neat place. They sort of consider themselves a republic in themselves. So the story behind that was that in 1982, there was a blockade by the Coast Guard. I don't know what the Coast Guard, it was the Border Patrol, who blocked all of the roads to the Keys for days and put in just shut down tourism in the Keys. And Key West mayor took them to court to try to get them to stop it, and they were thrown out of court. So he asked, well, what are we going to do? Well, he said, well, they blocked us off from the United States. I guess we're going to have to secede from the United States. So they declared independence, the Conch Republic. They took their schooner called Western Union and attacked the Coast Guard ship, the Diligence. They attacked it with water balloons, conch fritters, and stale Cuban bread. And the Diligence fought back with hoses. And after 20 minutes, the Conch Republic surrendered and asked for foreign aid, which they haven't gotten. But what did happen was they disbanded the blockade, and tourism came back. But we actually followed the tradition there and flew the courtesy flag for the Conch Republic while we were there. So the other things that were interesting, Fort Zachary was there. Fort Zachary was kind of interesting because it was during the Civil War. Florida was more in the Confederacy, but Key West was on the edge. But a garrison of Union soldiers captured Fort Zachary and used it as a naval blockade, and it was one of the reasons why the Union was able to prevail. Hemingway is everywhere. Of course, he's gone, but his cats are still there. His house was interesting. We saw some million-dollar yacht racing there. And the other place that was very interesting was the botanical gardens. They had all kinds of palm trees that we've never seen before. Very interesting. They also had boats that they collected from people who've tried to make the trip from Cuba. And it's amazing what kind of boats people tried to go those 90 miles from Cuba. It was incredible. That was like the most seaworthy one we saw. And I'll leave you in a description of our trip with our saga of the rigger. While we lost our anchor light, and so I wanted to go up the mast to fix it, but as you see, I can't even go up a ladder. So Michelle kind of nixed that and asked around, and they said, oh yeah, you got to get John, I think his name's John, you got to get John to come out. So we called up John, and we couldn't get him, and finally he called us back. We left messages. He called us back about 10 o'clock at night and says, yeah, I'll come there now and fix your ankle light. I said, John, it's 10 at night. It's dark. And I said, why don't you come tomorrow? He said, okay, I'll come there at 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, oh, that's great. We'll be waiting for you. About noon, I called him up and said, John, what, are you going to come? He said, well, yeah, I'm going to come. My ex-wife says she's going to off herself, so I have to take care of her, tuck her out of it, and then I'll be over there. So we didn't expect to see him, but he showed up a few hours later, and he said, you got a halyard? I said, yeah, I've got a halyard. I said, you want me to winch you up? He said, no, I just attach it to myself. I'm going to climb your mast. I said, what? And he said, just take up the slack. So he jumped on the mast, climbed up on his own to the top, fixed it. It was a wiring problem. He fixed it. He said, you have warm light. You need to have cool light. Here, I'm going to get you another bulb. So he came back down. He went to every store in Key West, couldn't find a bulb, came back, went back up the mast, put it back on, and came back down. And Michelle said, oh, thank you, how much do we owe you? He said, oh, yeah, give me about $40. I said, what? So she gave him considerably more than that, and then he left, and she said, wow, that was interesting. I wonder if this guy has a website, we can learn more about him. And it turns out he did have a web presence. When I Googled him, what came up was rigger jailed for running mobile meth lab. This guy was really nice. Actually, he was really nice. But you know, we thought about it, but we thought about it for a while. We thought, actually, this is really kind of cool. This is sort of really Key West. You have a guy who's made some really bad choices in his life. He turned his life around. Everybody at the marina there loved him. He really had just become a different person. I just thought, well, that's great. Good for him.
Did you ever run into Dan Hall?
Yes, we had dinner with him.
Okay, because his boat's there a lot of the time now.
It's not there now.
Oh, it's not now?
No, it's in Norfolk?
Yeah.
It's in Norfolk.
Okay.
Or somewhere north of
But he
Norfolk.
spends the winter there.
He was in there. He was
there.
He was embarrassed to say that he was staying on the dirt. But he was near the marina that he usually stays at.
And he's doing okay.
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what I was going to tell you. What I was going to do is tell you a little bit about what we learned in case anybody's foolish enough to do the same thing we did. Just want to go through a few things that I thought were really useful to us to have. We either thought of them before we left or learned on the way. One of the things you can't do the trip without is a VHF radio. That's absolutely essential to talk to people on locks, talk to people on bridges, but also to communicate with other boaters because you're always talking to other boaters in the water. Here we don't use radio very much, but there you turn it on when you start the engine and you leave it on. The other thing we found really useful was radar. We had Doppler radar. That's not absolutely essential, but some radar anyway, and AIS. AIS is just a way of making yourself known to other boaters, and if they have AIS, you can see them. As you go to busy harbors, not all pleasure boaters have AIS, but all commercial boaters have AIS. So you can see all of the container ships, and the container ships can see you. So that's really the reason more than anything else to have it. It's also really useful. Both of them are very useful in fog. Radar is also useful for giving you an idea of how far off you are from the shore sometimes when you're anchoring in a narrow area. You turn the radar on and see where you are relative to the shore. That's really useful. Anyway, a washdown pump for your anchor is essential, particularly I think in the Chesapeake, but also in Cuba Lake. You don't want the clay from the bottom of the Chesapeake is sort of this mucky, ugly clay, which is wonderful for anchoring. We almost never put the hook down and not catch. But when you pull it up on deck, it's really awful. So having a way of washing that down is really useful. We found that a spade anchor and we had all chain rode and a windlass, and that just made our life easier. People can argue about what anchors work and don't work, but we had a rook and a spade, which is really good. You probably should have a second anchor. We carried a Fortress, then we had a combination of chain and rope, but we also had a kellet to keep the rope down so it wouldn't wrap our keel. We found solar panels to be extremely useful. We had about 500 watts of solar. That kept our batteries charged even though we ran our refrigerator all the time. It's really a good idea to do this. Other people ran their engines on anchor to keep their battery charged. It's the worst thing you can do to your engine. I can tell you, you want to baby your engine. You don't want to cause any additional grief, but it can clog up with carbon if you try to do that. If you leave with house batteries are in good condition is a good idea. We had 120 amp hour batteries, AGM, that worked beautifully for us. We had DC refrigeration, and we got a suggestion on the way down that we should insulate the top of it. So we got a yoga mat and put it on top of it. And then we put some reflective insulation on the inside, and that really helped with the energy efficiency. The other thing to do is take as many spare parts as your room and budget permits. Spare parts, except for zincs, oil filters, and fuel filters, spare parts are not there to use when you break down. They are the things that don't break down. So the more spare parts you take, the fewer things can break down. Okay.
How many hours? Was your engine pretty new?
Our engine we left it was $2,600.
So,
Not that old.
so you had more equipment issues than ordinarily you would have, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It seems like you did.
Yeah, we did. But that was the second time we had the raw water pump die on us. We had it one other time. I won't go into this. Anyway, what else?
Water and fuel.
Yeah, we had water and fuel. We actually added those later. Basically, adding some fresh water tanks, that we just strapped on the outside, just allowed us to go longer in between marinas or stopping in marinas. And same thing with fuel. It's really good to have a reliable dinghy and dinghy motor. We have a rigid dinghy on davits and an electric motor, and both of them served us well the whole time. Lots of people use inflatable dinghies and tow them and use gas powers, and like that, but we preferred what we have. The other thing that you don't necessarily think about is extra dock lines and fenders. This is really important for the Erie Canal. We had a few extra 45-foot dock lines. They weren't even long enough. We had to tie dock lines together sometimes to tie up with the walls along the Erie Canal. And lots of fenders on the Erie Canal is a really good idea because you need them on both sides of your boat because you never know which side you're going to tie up. I took a folding bicycle that came in handy. In fog, we had our radio does automatic foghorn signals. Twice in fog it died. And one time, so then I used the air horn to do our fog signals, and then that ran out of air, and so at one point I was blowing a whistle every 2 minutes. But anyway, it's good to have those. It's good to also have radar and AIS and fog. We found it also can get cold even in the south, and we took an electric heater along, but we ran off an inverter, but only for a very short time because it used so much energy. You can get a propane heater that'll run off those little green cans. We actually did that at the end, but it's really dicey. It's supposed to be used on the indoors, but we did have the carbon monoxide alarm going off one time with it, so we were a little nervous about that. But one good thing we found was to take an electric blanket and that could warm that up for a short time, and it made it nicer. In hot weather, to keep the bugs out, we ended up replacing our screens with CM-proof screens, which helped quite a lot. Go to the next one. And then some other things we learned. The main thing that's important is to learn about the weather, sort of have some understanding about how low pressure works, how high pressure works, and that sort of thing. And also have access to detailed weather reports, whether it's with SSB, internet, or just your cell phone. But it's always good before you take off to check the weather because you never know when it's going to change. We consulted with Chris Parker for the Marine Weather Service anytime we went out into the ocean. He was extremely useful. It was of really good value. Michelle planned ahead for the whole trip, looked at marinas, anchorages, hurricane haul-outs all the way around. She spent months doing that. It turned out she had this documentation that was extremely useful. But what's really important then is more detailed planning when you're moving. We planned in some detail for the coming week, mainly because we wanted to think about what the weather patterns were, where we wanted to be for what weather, and also, what are the tides going to be, etc. But really what's important is to plan in detail for your next day, looking at what the currents are going to be, what the tides are going to be, where the shallow areas are going to be. This becomes important, in almost everywhere you go. The tides and depths are important in South Carolina and Georgia. The currents and the winds is important in like the Delaware Bay and out in the ocean and the Hudson River. We use 2 charting systems, Navionics and Aquamap, on the iPad. We also had a Raymarine Axiom display, which we hardly ever use. It's far inferior to the iPad. Navionics is good because it has sonar maps that are crowdsourced. It's not always correct though. Aquamap is good because it's updated more often. It also has soundings done by the Army Corps of Engineers. So you can really find the shallow areas. Using both of them and judging by, which going the most conservative route kept us out of trouble most of the time. There was one place I remember where Navionics, an entrance to Anchorage, told us we had 13 feet of water, and Aquamap told us we had 2 feet of water. We used a different entrance. The other thing we learned was that we put any scraps of food, any wet trash, we bagged it up and kept it in the refrigerator. We learned that when we were 2 weeks on the Anchorage and we had it stored in the aft berth, and it was way too smelly to go on. So that was a good thing to learn, actually. The other good thing to have is boat cards. We exchange cards with our emails with other boaters. We found that we often had questions that we wanted to ask somebody. If we exchanged a boat card with them, we could email them and ask them some question about what is it, how was your passage, or do you like your wind generator or whatever. So that was really useful. One last thing. So just a few resources that we use. We found the waterway guides not particularly useful. They tell us that every place you go is the most wonderful place on earth, which is not true. But they need to keep their advertising up. Skipper Bob has these publications that are actually very useful if you keep them up. They tell you about where the good anchorages, where are the bridges, what the phone numbers for the bridges are, how you call them on VHF, etc. And then I mentioned Bob Scherer, or Bob 423. He has a cruising guide that he updates every year for the intercoastal waterway, as well as tracks the updates that are useful. We use some websites for, Michelle got local notice to mariners from the Coast Guard every day. And that was actually really good because sometimes we learned about like bridges that were inoperable or places we had to go around. That was good. And then during hurricane season, we use the NOAA site to track all the hurricanes. And then just for various apps, we found for weather, Windy, Predict Wind, and Storm Radar were mainly the places we went to. One that I'll mention that I really liked is East Coast Trip Planner with Currents and Tides. It doesn't have a very attractive name, but it's a really useful app for planning going down the Delaware Bay or going up the Hudson River. It gives you very, very accurate estimates of what the tides will be when if you plan a trip. When we anchored, every time we anchored, we set an anchor alarm. We used Anchor, this program called Anchor on the iPhone, and Aquamap also has a good anchor alarm. We only, in all the time we anchored, maybe over 100 times, we only dragged one time after we were sure we had set the anchor. And that was pretty soon after we stopped. Most of the time on this trip, we were really lucky with anchoring. And then you can sometimes slip at a marina with Saga Slip or Dockwell. Dockwell is the one that's used most. So, that's it. So,
What month did you go again? What month did you leave?
we left September 3rd.
I'm surprised that you weren't worried about hurricanes.
We were worried about
Because I remember
it.
Dan Hall used to tell me they wouldn't allow him to go anywhere until November.
Yeah, no, that's true. So we checked with the insurance, and we were allowed to go to just above Savannah, just above Savannah. And after November 1st, we were able to go below.
Okay.
But we had so many breakdowns it didn't matter.
So you and Michelle both, I mean, I know Michelle's been planning this for how many years? So I know that he's the spokesman, but I mean, behind every great man, great woman.
Yeah. On the Erie Canal, one of the things we heard that one of the lock operators say, she driving the boat. and I didn't tell the guy that the reason she driving the boat was that he doesn't know how to drive the boat. So she, I have to say, you know, we were, I don't know how many times we came into a marina where you know, the wind was really whipping and it was really hard to get in. She brought us in beautifully, and the guys, one of the dock hands would say, "God, you really brought that boat in really well." I said, "Don't look at me."
So, Robert, was there anything aside from the breakdowns that surprised you? I mean, with all, I know you guys are thorough planning this down to detail, but was there something that you said, "Whoa, I never thought of that"?
I think the thing that surprised me was we thought we were ready because we had planned for it, right? And we had not anticipated the cold, how cold it would be. And we brought blankets, but it gets really cold in a boat. So that was huge. And then the day that he mentioned there in North Carolina, we actually woke up to frost up in our boat. It was just, that was wonderful. That's what made us start thinking about wind generators. We don't have a wind generator now, but we talked to people who did have wind and sun, and they had plenty of energy for heat. So we were thinking of wind generators.
What was the total duration from leaving to returning?
For the time,
Yes.
we left on September 30th, got back May 25th.
Well, you're a hero to me.
Anybody could do it.
I don't think so. That was a lot of togetherness.
So what do you think the most common question we've had?
We were
At the end? Or
What, along the way or at the end? The most common
are you
question.
having fun?
No. Are you speaking to each
Are you
other?
saying?
And I would always say, I don't know, talk to that woman.
What a great.
This was a great presentation.
Yeah. I'm impressed that you remember all those details without notes. But you didn't look at them.
Yeah, but you see, I had these because you know what happens is, you know, after a certain age, well, I don't think you know this yet, but
Absolutely not.
no. But what happens is you just can't bring back a name. So I wrote down all the ones that I'd forgotten in the past. But fortunately, I didn't.
You did, you were,
Thank you. And I'm now in crutches too. That's great.
but you did learn a lesson after you got home.
Yes.
No more climbing ladders.
No, I have to just climb masts, I guess.
Yeah, no.
You can slide right down.
You got the rigor for that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for such an informative, scary, inspiring talk about this wonderful trip. Congratulations both on this planning and courage to be able to do this. And I just have one question. Basically, how long did it take you to get from North Marina, North Docks here? How can we get
About 10 ago. So it's about 5 days on the canal, and then now it's about 3 or 4 days. But you have to stop to put your mask on. So it takes we didn't do it that fast. It's about 3 or 4 days sailing.
And that's why I came to the canal and
Yeah. If you get the air canal notices, you'll see that they're always closing locks. So you can always get stopped. But we were lucky in both of those. Oh, well, the worst one is probably the one at the top floor. If you get under that one, yeah, but no, there's some that there are a few that are really, I mean, like the one I showed with Great Bridge, which has to be Virginia, that's probably, I don't know, it's probably not even, but that has some. But, you know, there's lots and lots of, lots and lots of people with collars, were able to go in and do business with the other ones. But they had to stop for some students.